She attempts to bring this to the Republic. She attempts to bring this to the pub. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we're going to be doing another round of my Star Wars canon project. Alright, before I get into anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments, have you read any of these Star Wars books? Are you now interested in Star Wars books? Alright, so if you are new here, hi, I'm doing a project in which I am trying to read all of the Star Wars canon novels this year, focusing mainly on the adult and YA ones. I am going chronologically based on the list I found at Yoda's That's not how that works. At Yoda's datapad, which I'll put a link to in the description down below if you are interested. I'm well into phase 2 now, and this is gonna be our third video, so if you're interested in the prior, I'll put a link to the playlist up above. However, honestly, a lot of these, especially the YA ones, you could probably read as standalones. Speaking of, this time around, the first book I'm gonna be reading is a young adult one. It is Out of the Shadows by Justina, Ireland, and it looks like we are following a cargo freighter, 𝗖cie, who is really trying to ensure that her team doesn't go into debt any more than they already are. She's trying to ensure her family's cargo business succeeds, but unfortunately for her, while traveling to Coruscant hoping to maybe find a new job or a new proprietor, she ends up getting dragged into the middle of this warring business between these two big name families who are trying to decide who has rights over this section of space in the Outer Banks. However, at the same time, we're also following a young Jedi, Vernestra, as well as her Padawan, 𝗖cie, who end up teaming up with Comac and 𝗖ście, two characters we've met previously, trying to help with this dispute over the section of the Outer Rim. I am excited to see more of 𝗖ście, as he was a Jedi we had met previously, or well, a Padawan we had met previously in Into the Dark. Also, I'm intrigued to meet Vernestra, as I know she is a very young Jedi. I think she's like still maybe 17, 18, but she is so accomplished. She has already been named a Jedi Master. That's a really big deal. Then after that one, I am going to be reading Tempest Runner by Cavan, and this one is actually a audio drama. The audiobook is fully casted, full production. I read one of these previously and I did enjoy it, but I had some issues because you couldn't get as much depth from the characters when everything is dialogue based. I'm a little hopeful maybe that'll be different here, as it seems this one is mostly going to be focusing on Lorna D. Now, Lorna D is one of the top lieutenants in the 𝗖ście organization. We've already seen in some of the prior books that Lorna is not to be messed with. She is also willing to double cross anybody needed. She is doing what she has to be the best. Unfortunately, that has kind of put her in some people's crosshairs, namely her boss, the 𝗖cie of the 𝗖ście. Honestly, I'm very excited for this one to see more about one of the other villain characters. I've been fascinated by Marchion Ro, the 𝗖cie, but I think it'll be interesting to see more on one of the others, especially Lorna, because she's probably one of the biggest named female characters we've met in the 𝗖ście so far. And of course, I am all for a female badass villain, so can't wait to get to this one. Then I have the third book and the adult section thus far in this little, I guess you could say, its own series in which the Jedi are fighting the 𝗖ście, and that one is The Fallen Star by Claudia Gray. It looks like we are once again returning to Starlight Beacon, a space station that has recently been opened in the Outer Rim, but has unfortunately been the cause of a lot of drama and a lot of chaos because the 𝗖ście are not taking too kindly to the Republic trying to establish itself in this outer area of space. The first book in this little series, Light of the Jedi, was not my favorite, but things went a bit better for me in the second. Third, we're once again returning to a lot of the same characters. For example, Elzar Mann, Stellan Gios, Bel Zettifar. By this point, I've had a lot more time with those characters. I'm more invested in their stories and the dynamics they have. I've seen more of that in the second book. So hopefully this one is going to be an exciting, heart-racing time, but I'm also hopeful that not too many of the ones I actually like die. That would be nice. And then finally, I have Midnight Horizon by Daniel Jose Older. This is once again a young adult novel, and we are going to be following more of Comac and 𝗖ście. It looks like they are actually going to be on Corellia and kind of handling some of the fallout of 𝗖ście attacks. They end up working with a security guard, Crash, who has recently lost one of her men to the 𝗖ście. But at the same time, of course, there's going to be some politics going on with some of the elite on Corellia. Those are the 4 books I'm going to be reading for this video. I am very excited to continue this journey. Here's hoping that this one goes pretty well, and I will talk to y'all again when I've officially started into Out of the Shadows. Hey guys, so I have started into Out of the Shadows, and honestly we are not off to a bad start. I was a little nervous going into this one because I thought it was young adult, but my library had it marked in the middle grade section, so I was questioning whether or not I should actually try to read this one, seeing as how I did say when starting this project I was only going to focus on the adult and young adult novels. I do think my library just has it shelved wrong. I am going to talk to them about that. A lot of the previous books I've been reading for this project kind of have direct sequels. Convergence had Cataclysm, Path of Deceit had Path of Vengeance, Light of the Jedi had The Rising Storm, but this one doesn't really feel like a direct sequel to Into the Dark, though there are elements of that book and the characters from that book who we are revisiting here, but I think you could start with this one and you wouldn't be too lost not having read the prior book, just in case anybody's interested. 𝗖cie is definitely going through it, but things just get worse. Another element connecting to actually Light of the Jedi and The Rising Storm is that 𝗖cie's ship is forced out of hyperspace and then taken by the 𝗖cie, so she's really starting to struggle. She attempts to bring this to the Republic's attention, but instead is noticed by this really rich guy from the Graf family who basically pathed out hyperspace. He's trying to take advantage of her story to further his own agenda. And I gotta say, everything going on in that storyline is really intriguing. It's got me really engaged, especially because there was this recent reveal that took place. I'm much more invested in 𝗖cie and her story, her background, and also like how is she going to handle this moving forward. And then at the same time, she's an underdog character, and I mean everybody loves an underdog, so it's hard not to root for her. Across most of the Star Wars books I've read so far, you do get some perspective of a villainous character, and thankfully we do have one of those here. It is a 𝗖cie that we were once again introduced to in Into the Dark, but then at the same time that character's story also parallels the Jedi Padawan that we're following, 𝗖cie. Also met Into the Dark. He was kind of the nerdy guy that didn't want to be an adventurer, but now is sort of officially outside of his shell, and so I really love seeing that growth from him, even though we're not watching it progress, but we're seeing it in the character as he's introduced here. At the same time though, we also have a different Jedi that's similar in age to 𝗖cie, but she is actually not a Padawan. She is one of the youngest Jedi they've ever had. She's 17 and already has her own Padawan. She's incredibly strong, incredibly talented when it comes to the Force, so that's really cool, but she has a really hard time trying to find an identity as a teacher when she's not that much older than her Padawan. Everything we've learned about Venestra I do really like. She's young, she's an overachiever, but she's very respected by all of the older Jedi, and at the same time she has this really strong and uncommon ability through the Force that she's still not really comfortable with and is still investigating on her own, so I can't wait to see more exploration around that. I realized that I'm loving the diversity in the Jedi characters we've seen so far in all of the different books, because every one of them has a different strength, a different speciality, and it's really interesting to see that and how they grow with it, how they use it, just like the breadth of the Force that's involved in this universe. And even though it does feel like one of those things where it's constantly growing and there's always a new ability added, I also like that there are limitations listed. I've recently learned that I hate when there's this overpowered ability but no real explanation to it. But thankfully though, that hasn't happened here. The authors provide explanation to these new abilities when they are introduced. However, I'm just at the halfway point and I'm still not quite sure how the storyline between the Jedi and 𝗖cie is going to interact, or if it will. It's possible these could kind of be more parallel stories. However, I am hopeful to see that because it's more entertaining when the stories eventually collide. At this point, I don't really know how or what's going to happen there, but I'm invested enough to keep going. Hey guys, so I have finished Out of the Shadows, and yeah, this started really strong, but unfortunately it just ended on an unsatisfying note. This book has middle book syndrome, which is kind of funny to say. Doesn't really feel like anything super important is tackled in this book alone. This one, it kind of feels like you could skip over it and not really be missing out on much. We continue to follow 𝗖cie. We also have our multiple different Jedi and Padawan. Eventually they do interact and basically are traveling to the section of space that the Grafs are wanting to take over for their testing. But at the same time, like what you expect from the summary of this book, you're probably 80% in before you officially surpass everything brought up in the summary. It really felt like the plot just built and built and built, but it didn't really go anywhere. There's also a little bit of a romance between 𝗖cie and another character that we meet, Jordana, that's really underdeveloped. It very much was unnecessary. It seemed so small and insignificant. In comparison to some of the romance stories I've seen in prior books, this one just felt nothing really was developed there at all. Honestly, I think the biggest highlights of this book for me were Vernestra and her Padawan 𝗖µ. I liked seeing the different abilities they had. I liked seeing the relationship and Vernestra's struggle with her role as a mentor when she's still so young. I really liked 𝗖ście, but he was pretty insignificant in the story, and also the villainous character who worked with the 𝗖cie, she too really didn't impact anything too much. Apart from those two being connected to the prior book, they don't go through any growth. They aren't really integral to the plot, so I don't understand why they were there. As I said, it took so long for this plot to actually go anywhere. By the time you finish out all of the events mentioned in the summary, the book is almost over, and then it doesn't really resolve anything that's presented. It's such a middle book. Ended this and I was unsatisfied, unfortunately. So my rating for this one came out to 3 stars. It's one of the lower ones we've read so far, which I'm bummed about. It does kind of set up a little bit of background for the 𝗖cie character that will be a main player in Tempest run. So there's that at least. Hey guys, so I have hit the halfway point into Tempest Runner by Cavan Scott. This one is another audio drama, as I probably mentioned before. I do think I'm enjoying this one more than the prior audio drama I listened to in this series, which was The Battle of Jeddah. And I think the biggest reason for that is we're really only focusing on Lorna D. She is a Tempest Runner for the 𝗖cie. And Tempest Runners are like the highest of the high, apart from Marcion Rowe, who leads this entire group. But currently at this point, the Republic thinks Lorna D is the eye. They think she is the leader of the 𝗖cie and are trying to find her. You see her squadron going up against a bunch of the Republic and Jedi. Things get a little bit dicey as far as the Republic now thinks Lorna is dead, but Lorna actually ends up imprisoned, and we're seeing how she is living with this life, but also planning to eventually get out. That's what we've been focusing on for the last few parts of the book, but we also have these past timelines where we're seeing how Lorna grew up and sort of how she even got involved in the 𝗖cie in the first place. So it does alternate back and forth, and if you're only listening to it on audio, it's kind of hard to realize the change in those timelines. I did notice if you are reading it physically, you'll have like the scene, and then when it changes timelines, there's this cut at the bottom. I'm really liking this actually, and I do think a big part of it is because we're spending so much time with Lorna and seeing her background. It's very much a audio character study essentially, and I do tend to love character study stories, so that's not super surprising. On one hand, you don't want to like Lorna because she works for the 𝗖cie and you know they're the bad guys, but at the same time it's hard not to root for Lorna because she is so ruthless and determined to survive no matter what. And this woman has been through a lot. Even though she does still have to answer to Marcion Rowe, she keeps strategizing and planning in the background. I am really liking her. I'm having a good time following her. We've seen a few Jedi characters, namely Avar Kriss, Stellangios, I can't remember her name, but there's another female Jedi who we did meet in prior books, as well as her Padawan, Bulgara, I think is his name, and he's a Wookiee. I do really like him. So right now, this is honestly going fantastically. I once again will always recommend listening to the audiobooks because, especially in the audio drama situations, they're full cast, they are full productions, there's tons of sound effects. So if you read it physically, you're kind of missing out. Hey y'all, so I have finished out Tempest Runner by Cavan Scott, and first off, this went fantastically by comparison to Battle of Jeddah, and I genuinely think a large part of that is because we spend so much time with Lorna D. With the sort of setup of an audio drama where everything is dialogue based, it's kind of hard to really get to know the characters, but when you really only focus on one character, you still can manage it. I think Scott actually did that really well here because I love Lorna. I am so invested in her. Even if she is the definition of gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss, love her for it. Really, the entirety of this book is just exploring her character and how she's come to be this Tempest runner. The traumatic things she's experienced in her past and also the terrible things she has done in her past, and how those parallel with what she's experiencing at the present timeline, then sort of how you can see things developing for the future with Lorna. And I really liked this. This came out to 4.5 stars. I really don't have anything else to say about it. This one was great and I highly recommend it. Do not be fooled by the fact that it is so chunky. It's 6 hours on audio and it is so worth it. No thoughts, no notes, head empty, let's go. So I have hit the halfway point into The Fallen Star. I think this is actually gearing up to be my favorite of the sort of trilogy of the adult novels in the current phase. So far, I am really liking this. I think it also is helped by the fact that I'm finally attached to these characters. We've spent a good amount of time with all of the major ones we're following. We have Stellan, we have Elzar, Belle, Indira, and then also one I was a little surprised to see because we're initially introduced to her in a young adult novel was Orla, and she had been considering becoming a Wayseeker, and she's taken that jump here, and I really enjoy her. On top of that, the dynamic she has with Stellan is fantastic because the way each of their relationships work with the Jedi Council and the Force itself are very opposed. Whenever they try and communicate about this sort of stuff, they're just talking over each other because they each have such different beliefs on how this should be handled and how they should treat it. It's been really fun in that regard. I'm bummed that Elzar is no longer working with 𝗖cie, I think was her name, that we were introduced to in The Rising Storm, because they had some fun interactions. And there was this mention of the fact that they could help each other when it came to their relationships with the Force, as Elzar has been struggling with it and 𝗖cie is sort of pulled away from it. But unfortunately, we didn't really see any more of that. Rather, Elzar has been working alongside Orla to improve his relationship with the Force, and I do like that. However, every single time we see him struggle or take a step backwards in terms of his progress, it always has to do with his romantic feelings, and it's just so over the top that it's cringy. And obviously I realize I'm not supposed to be invested in a romantic relationship between 𝗖cie and this other character, but oh god, it's a little painful to see Elzar's reactions, I'll be honest. Stellan continues to feel like a Kenobi light to me, if I'm being honest. And then I do like Belle as our Padawan. There's been a few mentions of Wreath, another Padawan that I really like. A team of characters were the spaceship crew from Into the Dark. They are seen here again and are once again working with Orla and end up taking Elzar to Starlight Beacon, this way station in the Outer Rim that has gone through a lot in this series, and we occasionally will see from somebody in the Nihil or Marchion Ro himself are reminded that he's not done yet. He has more plans, and it's really intense. I'm really impressed with the writing around Marchion Ro throughout all of these books because he just feels so purely, coldly evil. It feels like what he is doing is for a reason. Like, he can justify it to himself. And I am so intrigued to find out what that is. I want to know so badly. I'm fascinated by his character thus far. So like I said, we are once again on Starlight Beacon, and once again, the Nihil are getting involved or not leaving it be. It's gonna be rough, and I'm a little nervous for the final climax of the story, but events so far have been very fun. We are seeing all of these different cast of characters, which thankfully I've connected with many of them at this point, so I don't mind bouncing around, and basically watching as they are trying to help people in this area. They're just trying to respond to the events of the prior book, but like I mentioned, the Nihil are making things easy for them. While the pacing in the first half has been on the slower side, it's building up. We're gearing up towards something. We've finally had a few heart-racing scenes and some hard-hitting scenes as well. I do really like seeing the impact of the prior events on Stellan, on Belle, on Elzar, and how their reactions and their thought process about their reactions and their emotions to it, how they handle them, how they justify them, and also how they have to remind themselves to not let those feelings overtake them. So I am really liking that. I think Gray's writing when it comes to like the humanizing parts of these different Jedi has been very well handled thus far. I think the character work in this one is actually going really well. But again, a large part of that is because I have this basis with the characters now. Like, one of my biggest critiques of this phase so far is that every single book has such a large cast. I'm gonna stop rambling. I will talk to y'all again when I have finished this book out. Hey guys, so I finished out The Fallen Star, and I actually really liked this one, which greatly amuses me because apparently this has quite low ratings marked on Goodreads. I think this is probably my favorite of the adult trilogy in phase 2 so far, and I think a large part of that comes down to the fact that this reads like a survival action story. From what I can pick up, it seems people are bugged by the fact that the plot isn't really developed more for this phase, but I didn't really even mind that fact because I actually enjoyed the entire reading experience of this one. I finally had strong feelings towards a lot of the cast. I was actually invested in seeing them succeed or seeing them fail, seeing as how we do actually have chapters through some of the villain characters. I cared a lot more about the dynamics, the relationships between the different characters, and the fates of each of the characters as danger arose. Because wow, there was a lot of suspense going on. This definitely pulled me to the edge of my seat time and time again. Belle and Burryaga, our Padawan, were two I really enjoyed following. First off, I loved Burryaga. He was adorable, and I love the juxtaposition of a giant Wookiee who is a very strong empath and has a really sweet disposition, but, you know, is a Wookiee with a lightsaber. I really liked the developed friendship between Belle and Burryaga. I liked the connection they had because of their struggles from the traumatic events they experienced in the prior books. Belle is definitely still having a very hard time with his grief and his guilt from the events in the prior book. And again, Burryaga is a very strong empath, so he can feel these emotions coming off of Belle, and especially with events of this book, it makes it harder to ignore those. So there are these nice little moments between them where that is acknowledged and they talk about it. Then when it comes to the Jedi characters, the trio, I guess you could call them, Stellan, Avar, and Elzar, I've had very mixed feelings about throughout the series. I would say I liked Avar the most in the first book, but Stellan was very strong in the second, and Elzar was probably the winning one in this book. These three were really close friends as Padawans, but as Jedi, their paths have really diverged. And so it's interesting to see any interactions between that trio, because they know each other so well, and sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes that's a bad thing. I really enjoyed seeing Stellan and Elzar leaning onto each other at times. I finally started to feel actually convinced by Elzar's struggles with the dark side and the way those struggles have impacted his relationships with Stellan and Avar. I adored seeing more of Orla, who is a Wayseeker that we met in one of the YA books. I was very pleasantly surprised at the number of tie-ins from the young adult books to this one. Not to say prior YA books haven't influenced the adult ones, but those connections were a lot smaller. Whereas in this one, I felt like I was actually really benefited by the fact that I had read those young adult books and knew those characters or the experiences being mentioned. Like I said, across the board, I really liked this one. I think my biggest drawback was actually the Nihil. As we've seen in the prior books so far in this phase, the Nihil are space pirates or space Vikings. They're not religious zealots, and yet some of the actions they take in this book felt more reminiscent to what the Path of the Open Hand would have done in phase 1. Felt out of place and odd and really messed with my perception of these villains and their role in the story. That said though, I do think Marchion Ro is a very well done character. He is terrifying as a villain. I am fascinated by how he has planned all of this out to try and bring the Jedi down and take power over this section of the Outer Rim. He's so determined, and you can tell he's utilized a lot of the knowledge he's gotten from his family to do this, and all that stuff is callbacks from phase 1. So I love seeing those connections. Like I said at the beginning, there's not a ton of plot development in this one across like this entire phase so far, I guess I would say, a general plot of the Jedi versus the Nihil. This has been really slow moving, but again, I liked this one because it was so action filled. So yes, the plot pacing throughout this phase thus far has not been the best. I didn't mind it at all here. I actually really enjoyed this. This one actually came out to 4.5 stars, way higher than I was anticipating, if I'm being honest. Oh my God, I am so excited for the next books. Hey guys, so I've hit the halfway point into Midnight Horizons, and I'm gonna be honest, for how like angsty looking this cover is, this feels like very immature. Maybe not immature. This is constituted a young adult novel, and if you've watched this series from the beginning, I mentioned that I'm only reading the adult and young adult novels, but honestly this one reads like middle grade, and I think a large part of that is just because of Older's characterization of the Padawans we're following. Yes, we have followed Padawans for most of the YA books, but this is the first time I feel like they're kids. They don't seem like teenagers. They seem like kids. The tone around their dialogue all feels very modern. It doesn't feel that like special sort of balance between old school and futuristic that Star Wars tends to have. This feels like I'm listening in on a bunch of middle schoolers talking. And the biggest shame for me is particularly in the characterization of Reath, as he is a character that I've grown to like over the last few young adult stories. He's somebody who really rather be a historian and artificer. He doesn't want to be this adventurer, but has kind of fallen into it, and he's actually quite good. He's been working with Master Comac for some time now, and Master Comac is definitely starting to age. He isn't quite as spry as Reath is, and I like seeing how their relationship has evolved because of that shift in their dynamic. But I feel like that element, which is probably the most engaging part for me when it comes to any of the character relationships, is going so underutilized. Then on top of Comac, we also have, they are another Jedi and they're non-binary, which is very cool. But I don't get, first off, where they came from, because this is the first time I've heard this name, and most of the other books thus far, we tend to have repeating Jedi. So that did catch me off guard, but also we get these flashbacks to when they were younger and questioned their faith in the Jedi Order, questioned their role as a Jedi. They actually kind of stepped away temporarily due to romantic interests in this man. And I don't understand what's the necessity of it at all. Maybe it's going to tie into the plot, but by this point, halfway in, I don't see it, and I don't really feel like those pages are necessary. We also follow a few other Padawans that we haven't met previously, as far as I'm aware. In regard to the main plot, we're mostly focusing on Reath and Ram, one of the other Padawan, working with Crash, this young woman who runs a security company in Corellia. Crash is like 17, and yes, I get she inherited it from her mother, but I'm usually pretty good at suspending disbelief when it comes to like teenagers doing things that normal teenagers wouldn't in fantasy stories. But I will admit, how she is written, it's so hard for me to believe. It's so hard for me to suspend disbelief because she's pretty immature, honestly. So anyway, she runs the security company. One of her friends was taken or killed possibly in a Nihil attack against one of their clients. And so she's trying to find him, as well as trying to, figure out how the Nihil got in the middle of this. They're protecting this person, and like what the Nihil are even doing on Corellia, while Comac and Cantum, the adult Jedi, are following more like political maneuvering to kind of figure out where the Nihil are getting onto Corellia and why the people in power on Corellia are so insistent that the Nihil aren't there. The very basics of the plot are interesting. I just don't like how they're being handled and how they're like mixing together here. It also just feels very separate from the rest of the plot that's been happening through this phase. So yeah, this one's like not going well. I guess one positive thing is, since it does read so young, I am reading through it really fast. Hey friends, so apparently I totally forgot to film this update, but I finished out Midnight Horizons, and this is probably the lowest rated book I've read so far in this universe, and I really think the biggest reason for that is because it is mismarketed age-wise. I can still handle a YA novel, especially since some of these tend to handle some more heavier topics, but this reads like middle grade. Personally, I have a really hard time with middle grade. I have a hard time with the fact that it's juvenile, and that's how a lot of this book felt, unfortunately. Even when we were seeing through the adults' perspectives, it started well enough and I liked getting to know all of the characters, but at no point during the reading of this did I ever feel like what was happening was actually serious. I didn't feel as though the characters were taking this situation as seriously as they should have been, particularly the Padawans. And I also was really bummed about the fact that some of the returning characters we were seeing, the voice Older gave them did not match the voice that had been established with those characters in prior books. That was an issue I'd been a little concerned about going into this project, because a lot of times you'll have revisiting characters that are being written by different authors. But in the prior books I've read so far, that hasn't really been a glaring problem. I felt like every author has done a good job of trying to make the voice of those characters consistent, but that just didn't happen here with Wreath in particular. It also took me a little bit to understand where the plot was actually going and how it was going to connect with the overlying plot of this phase. I finally made the connection, and this kind of takes place roughly before and during the events of Fallen Star. But again, like, the events of that book in this story seem so minimized. Once I finally made that connection though, I just don't really feel like the events in this book really matter in the grand scheme of the plot. This is the lowest rated one I've given so far. It was 2.5 stars. I'm nervous for the next one, but this did not go well. This did not go well. And unfortunately, that is a very low note to end on here. So that's it for today, y'all. Thank you so much for going to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me a clack emoji in the comments. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me, linked in the description. I come out videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!